Today's video has what I think is a pretty controversial thesis. It's that infrastructure and right-of-way that were designed for rail transit are immensely valuable, and we should be using said infrastructure and right-of-way for rail transit. And yes, this is the kind of bold, outside-the-box thinking you come to this channel for, but it's particularly true when we're talking about certain parts of the borough of Queens in New York City, where there are massive transit needs but huge barren spaces on the MTA subway network. And full disclosure, my policy is still that viewer-suggested topics are always welcome. So when the people behind Queenslink found out that I was coming to New York, they pitched me on meeting them out in Ozone Park to walk the alignment and do some filming, in the hopes that I'd make a video and help raise awareness about the Queenslink effort. And I'm easy. Raising awareness and building a constituency for good ideas is kind of the mission of this channel. And honestly, at the end of my videos, I always give a special thanks to patrons, and this is why. If I have strong support, it means I can go do things like today's video for free. So we're going to tour the Queenslink alignment, and I want to get into some of the politics and the technical aspects. But first of all, what is Queenslink? It's the idea of taking the long-abandoned Rockaway Beach branch line, which once carried Long Island Railroad trains between the Rigo Park area in central Queens and the Rockaways at the south edge of the borough, and restoring train service, as well as creating new space for walking, biking, and recreation along the right-of-way. First of all, a very important clarification. Queenslink promotes the idea that transit service should be restored to the dormant Rockaway Beach branch line, specifically by diverting the M train from where it currently runs under Queens Boulevard, so that it instead runs all the way south to the Rockaways with 4 new stations. There's a competing, much more politically connected and better funded idea out there, Queens Way, which instead proposes that portions of the abandoned line be used to create a linear park with no transit service, maybe kind of reminiscent of the High Line. And I'll talk more about that as we tour the alignment. But again, I just want to emphasize how desperate the transit needs are in this part of New York City, and how well the abandoned alignment dovetails into the existing network. I mean, there's a reason rail was built here in the first place. Okay, let's go on a little tour. I met up with the Queenslink folks at the south end of the abandoned section of the line, which involved taking the A train out to the Rockaway Boulevard station. By the way, I find the variation in-vehicle display technology on the various subways just fascinating. Like, this A train has displays that tell you which car you're in and where the exits on the platform are. I'm sure I've seen this in other metro systems outside the US, but this was the first time I'd seen it in New York. Extremely useful, in my opinion. And I just love the urban fabric underneath the elevated lines all over New York City. Queenslink proposes a new M station right here at Liberty Avenue, and I'll take you to that location in a minute, but you can imagine how the additional foot traffic could really help support local businesses. Just to drive home the point, pun intended. This is Woodhaven Boulevard, right by the A train station, and it's typical of how people in this part of Queens are compelled to get north-south, since there's no rail connection. Okay, so here's the spot where the A train currently splits, with some A trains continuing east on Liberty Avenue to Ozone Park Lefferts Boulevard, and some turning south toward the Rockaways. And here you can see the condition of the Rockaway Beach line, and there is a long stretch of it that runs above grade on a viaduct, with the space underneath filled in over the years by a variety of businesses, most often, it seems, ironically, by auto repair shops of different kinds. And if you're a Queens Way booster, you're probably thinking, man, a defunct elevated rail structure in New York City? Jackpot. We know how this plays out. Convert it into a linear park with lots of cool public art and urban design elements, and then just sit back and watch the tourists flock to it and billions of dollars in economic development flood into the surrounding area. And look, make no mistake, I think the High Line was a very cool idea. It's well executed. I always go check it out when I'm in New York to see how it's continuing to develop. Of course, you could also make the argument that Manhattan could really use a north-south subway service around, say, 10th Avenue, but that's probably for a different video. So walking around Queens looking at defunct rail viaducts is cool, but what's actually much cooler is breaking the law by trespassing on city property, making the possibly imprudent decision to climb this dilapidated tower to get on top of the viaduct and see what's up. Let me preface this by saying the Queenslink reps that were with me made it very clear that I was undertaking all this at my own risk and they bore no liability for injury or death, or the fact that New York's finest might come looking for me once I put this video up online. But what do you expect? I'm a content creator, and what's better content than a disused piece of rail infrastructure that's overgrown with all kinds of vegetation and is pretty obviously used as a dumping ground / unauthorized party spot. Okay, so the Rockaway Beach Branch Line Viaduct doesn't quite have the same scenic vistas that the High Line does, but I just don't think you can call yourself an urbanist and not find something like this at least compelling, maybe even emotionally stirring. This was all built in an age when there was a different vision for New York City, with a dense network of rail lines serving all parts of Queens and Brooklyn, before it was decided that crisscrossing the outer boroughs with expressways was a better idea and more reflective of how we should be designing our cities. Now, the bad news for you historic preservationists is the viaduct has to be completely rebuilt in order to be able to carry both heavy rail transit and provide space for walking and biking, which is the vision for Queenslink. But the good news for the rest of us is the right-of-way and surrounding urban context is all here. A lot of what are always the most difficult parts of the planning and design process were already done over a century ago, and now we just have to have the good sense to capitalize on that. And also, let's be real, these structures where the east-west streets cross beneath, not in the greatest condition. I think this one at 101st Avenue is being held together with some combination of chewing gum, chicken wire, and fervent prayer. By the way, the Queenslink website does have some pretty cool renderings of what the viaduct could look like at certain points, including 101st Avenue. Again, this is a north-south corridor in a location where north-south rail connections just don't exist, but there are plenty of east-west lines to link up with. We already looked at the A line, and here at Atlantic Avenue, Queenslink is elevated and the Long Island Railroad Atlantic branch runs east-west under the street. This is a very active line running from Atlantic Terminal in downtown Brooklyn to Jamaica and points east. There was once an active LIRR station here, Woodhaven, which I'm told is still structurally viable despite having been shuttered since 1939. And the vision here is to reopen that station in coordination with a new Atlantic Avenue station on the elevated M line, which will vastly improve the connection between central Queens and all of Long Island to the east. There's also an abandoned LIRR substation here. Seems like a prime adaptive reuse candidate. In fact, the whole area is prime for transit-oriented development if this location becomes a busy transfer point. From Atlantic North, the Rockaway Beach line runs on an embankment rather than a viaduct, which you can see if you go down these side streets that dead end into cycle and fencing. Needless to say, there are a lot of homeowners here who aren't crazy about the idea of reinstituting rail service on this line, but there are also those who prefer to see the embankment put into use and managed properly, as opposed to having a dumping ground / party zone in their backyard. Trains that run on the solid earth of embankments don't generate nearly the noise that a train running on a structure does, but this is the kind of NIMBYism that you can at least start to understand. Now, there isn't enough right-of-way on the embankment to run both rail transit and have an active transportation facility, so the idea is to expand space for walking and biking here on 102nd Street. And now we're at Jamaica Avenue, where the J and Z train run. And again, there's no shortage of east-west train service in this part of Queens. I talked about this in my video about how traffic is worse than ever, particularly in New York, and one of the big points was we no longer live in a time where the overwhelming travel demand is between the outer boroughs and Manhattan, with commuting flows pulsing in and out every day. That was always an oversimplification of how cities work, and it's less true today than ever. The north-south rail connectivity between Queens and Brooklyn consists of the G train, and that's it. Planning for the Interborough Express is underway, but Queenslink would fill a hugely important gap too, and I'm going to talk a bit more about travel demand in a minute. But one thing you might be asking at this point is, we're talking about adding 4 new MTA stations on a segment of right-of-way that's about 4 miles long. How much of a difference can that even make? But we're talking about a city, probably the only city in the US where adding a short segment of heavy rail can pay a cascading number of dividends. I mentioned that the Rockaway Beach branch line isn't completely abandoned because the piece running south from around Liberty Avenue is part of the A train branch that runs down to the Rockaways, at least when it isn't undergoing maintenance. And this is key because Queenslink does a lot of different things, but probably the most important is it connects big employment and commercial destinations north-south in a way that doesn't currently exist. For example, the Aqueduct Racetrack and Resorts World, however you feel about the ongoing creep of legalized gambling, does employ a lot of people, and the whole freight and logistics operations area around the west side of JFK Airport is a huge employment generator too. And these are big pieces of the puzzle when you're looking at ridership forecasting. The other thing is all the network and knock-on effects that Queenslink could have. Yes, it creates a new north-south connection through Forest Hills, Woodhaven, and Ozone Park, but Queenslink increases the value of the whole network. M-Train riders would be able to access 4 new stations and have a much more efficient connection to Aqueduct and JFK, and riders on the J and A lines would have vastly improved heavy rail connections up to areas like Rigo Park, Jackson Heights, and Flushing. Also, rerouting the M-Train before it gets to Forest Hills 71st Avenue would free up station capacity and potentially allow restoration of G-Train service all the way to Forest Hills from Brooklyn, which would make that line immensely more useful since it currently terminates in Long Island City. Now, the Queenslink organization did get awarded a $400,000 grant from the US DOT's Reconnecting Communities program. You know, back when the Secretary of Transportation was someone who actually cared about transit. And the grant would fund a needed study of the economic, social, environmental, and equity impacts and benefits of the project. But in order to access those funds, they need to come up with $100,000 for the 80-20 match. Now, the good news is, at time of taping, they're over halfway there. Now, you might say, just hold up, aren't you missing the part where there's been a change in administration? And the new transportation secretary is a former reality TV guy who's in the process of redirecting federal funds to jurisdictions where the average person hasn't yet figured out exactly how birth control works. And yes, it's true. The Queenslink website is full of the kinds of forbidden language and wrongthink that may prevent the project from getting any federal support for the next 4 years. But to me, that doesn't mean you stop supporting it. It means the opposite. At the grassroots level, now is the time when we need to be doubling down on supporting things that really matter, transportation or otherwise. Promoting good ideas and making the case for why investing in our cities is so important is going to have to come from the ground up. Because for the next 4 years, politicians are not going to save us. Not because Democrats are useless, although, but because we didn't vote for them when the choice was so stark. So I say, forget Queenslink's $100,000 goal. Let's help them get the whole $500K they need to really get this thing moving. Okay, we didn't quite get done talking through the entire Queenslink alignment all the way north. My guided tour ended here at Park Lane South on the south edge of Forest Park, but the embankment that carried the Rockaway Beach branch line still exists, running all the way through the west edge of Forest Park and north through the Forest Hills neighborhood. The idea here is a bit different though. They're going to need a new structure to carry the M-Train over the LIRR Lower Montauk branch tracks, but from that point north, the M-Train line would be bored underneath the embankment. So there would be a new subway station at Metropolitan Avenue, but that station would be underground, and up on top of the embankment you'd have a linear park and active transportation facility. The different configuration will make sense once we talk through how all this works up in Rigo Park. First of all, the Queenslink alignment would have to get under the LIRR main line because today the M runs below grade on Queens Boulevard, along with the E, F, and R trains. In fact, when the Queens Boulevard subway was built in the 1930s, it was anticipated that the system would extend south in a later phase, and they actually built an underground bell mouth to facilitate a future connection to a southern extension along the Rockaway Beach branch right away. That extension, of course, has never been built, and Queenslink is the effort to finally right that wrong. And I mentioned network effects and how building Queenslink would facilitate travel between all kinds of origins and destinations in New York City. But most importantly, it creates a new connection into the most critical part of the greater Rigo Park / Elmhurst area. And if the federal government can't see the value in funding this, well, that's certifiably idiotic, so we might just have to figure out how to do it without them. Look, you guys, I have limited patience for following political news right now because reading it day in and day out makes me feel slightly insane. Doom scrolling is not my thing. But at the same time, I feel like we all have a responsibility to stay plugged in and have an informed point of view about the things that are currently happening in the US. And one way I like to stay up to date is by watching What to Follow USA, which reduces to a pretty appropriate acronym. It's from the great team at TLDR News, and the most recent installment at time of taping is this segment, Is America an Oligarchy? It tackles key issues in this very weird moment in US history, like what are the other two branches of government's real prospects for putting a check on executive power? Answer, poor. Whether this country is closer than ever to being an oligarchy? Answer, probably. And whether we should take Trump seriously about Greenland? And the answer to that question might give you indigestion. What to Follow USA is a Nebula original show and exclusive to the platform. The content I recommend when I talk about Nebula is often urbanism adjacent, and there are lots of great city planning, architecture, and engineering related creators on the platform, but Nebula is great for keeping up with current events too. And a lot of that kind of content, like real life lore's War Room, is exclusive to Nebula as well. Really, it's a great example of how Nebula empowers its creators to branch out into topic areas that might not find quite the right audience on other video sharing platforms. So if you want to support this channel's ability to continue to grow and connect with new audiences, signing up for Nebula really is the best possible way to do that. And when you sign up, it's not just a great way to invest in our community of creators, it's also an investment in continuing to make the Nebula streaming experience itself better and better. Because yes, Nebula is kind of like Netflix for people who are a little too into trains, but on a deeper level, it's a haven for content that's a little more thoughtful with a pretty big idea behind all of it, raising the level of the entire platform and growing it into a prestige streaming service. So if you use my custom link down in the description, you're going to get the best deal. All the Nebula content for 40% off the regular price when you sign up for an annual subscription, so $36 or $3 a month. And keep the lifetime offer in mind. $300, you pay once and you get Nebula for as long as both you and Nebula exist. And Nebula subscribers now get guest passes, one every month or 3 per quarter if you're on annual or lifetime. Once active, guests can binge all the Nebula content they want for a week, and no payment info is required. So tons of ways to share and enjoy Nebula, and no matter which way you go, a Nebula membership is a great way to demonstrate your support for a one-of-a-kind creator-owned platform, and to fund the continued production of amazing originals, and there's great new stuff hitting the platform all the time. So my recommendation, use my custom link to get Nebula for 40% off. That's $36 a year or $3 a month. It's nebula.tv/CityNerd, and then go watch the latest installment of What to Follow USA right now. And that's all I've got. Thanks for joining today, and thanks as always to the patrons whose direct support gives me the freedom to cover the things that I really think need to be covered. And in this case, I wanted to do what I could to elevate Queenslink into the national conversation. It's a great cause, and the fight they're in is kind of emblematic of the political headwinds that people with good ideas are facing in 2025. So thanks to the Queenslink reps for taking the time to walk a good chunk of the alignment with me, and for providing me with an appropriate verbal disclaimer before I climbed up on the viaduct. Anyway, keep the great topic suggestions coming. I'll be back with a new episode in either 1 or 2 weeks, TBD, but I'll see you then.